The food is still warm. She knows this because she made it 40 minutes ago and no one has touched it. The serving spoon is still in the rice, handle tilted at the angle she left it. The chicken is in the good dish, the one she only uses when she is trying. 2 plates on the table, candles she lit at 7 because he said he would be home by 7:30. It is now 8:53. She is not at the table. She is on the couch with her legs tucked under her and her phone in her lap, and she has been watching the door for an hour and 45 minutes with the particular stillness of a woman who has done this enough times that she no longer does it with hope. She does it the way you wait for a bus in a city where the buses are always late, not with expectation, just with the absence of anywhere else to be. The candles have burned down a third of the way. One of them is about to gutter. The door opens at 9:04. Marcus comes through it in his work clothes, dress shirt untucked, the tie he hates loosened to the second button, the specific exhaustion in his shoulders of a man who has been performing competence for 12 hours and has nothing left. He sets his keys on the hook by the door. He hangs his jacket. He turns and sees the table, the candles, the good dish, the 2 untouched plates, and something happens in his face. Not guilt, not surprise. Something quieter and more final. The expression of a man who has been shown a version of himself he cannot argue with. He looks at the table for 3 seconds. He looks at her on the couch. She looks back. Neither of them says anything. He goes to the table. He sits down. He serves himself. He begins to eat alone because she has already eaten. She gave up at 8:30 and made herself a bowl of cereal standing over the sink, and the candle on the left gutters and goes out while he chews, and he does not look up, and she watches him from the couch in the dark with the dead candle between them, and this is what the inside of a marriage looks like when it is running out of something neither person has named yet. But to understand how we got here, we have to go back. Jordan Alexis Webb married Marcus Isaiah Webb on a Saturday in October, 6 years ago, in a church that smelled like candle wax and chrysanthemums, in front of 112 people who all cried at different parts of the ceremony for different reasons. She cried during the vows. He cried during the song. She had known him for 3 years before the wedding, known him the way you know someone when you are paying full attention, which she was, because Marcus was the kind of man who rewarded full attention. He was a high school history teacher who coached the debate team on Thursdays and read actual physical books, and had a specific, practiced way of listening that made you feel like what you were saying was the most interesting thing in the room. He had grown up in Charlotte, the second of 4 children, with a father who had worked 30 years in the same job and a mother who made everything from scratch and prayed over everything she made. He carried this upbringing in the structure of how he moved through the world, deliberately, with care, with the particular attentiveness of someone who had been taught that how you show up for people is a form of love, and that love is not a feeling but a practice. He showed up for Jordan. Consistently, specifically, in the ways that mattered. He remembered the small things she mentioned in passing. He drove 40 minutes in a rainstorm to bring her medicine when she was sick during their 2nd year of dating, because she mentioned offhandedly that she was out of Dayquil, and he put his jacket on. He called her mother on her birthday every year without being asked. When Jordan had her first major professional failure, a grant application she had spent 4 months on, rejected with a form letter, he did not try to fix it or minimize it. He sat with her in it for as long as it needed. She loved him for all of this. She also, somewhere in the architecture of loving him, stopped noticing it. Not immediately, not in the first year, not even the second, but somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary days, in the business of building a life together, of careers and mortgages, and the relentless forward motion of adulthood, she stopped receiving what he gave the way you stop tasting food you eat every day. The attentiveness became the background. The showing up became the assumption. The man who drove 40 minutes in a rainstorm became the man who was supposed to be home by 7:30, and when he wasn't, she felt the absence, but she had long since stopped feeling the presence. This is not a sin that announces itself. It arrives wearing the face of maturity, of comfort, of the natural settling that people tell you is healthy, that happens in long relationships. That means you've moved past the performance stage into something real. Jordan believed this. She had read the articles. She had heard the sermons about the difference between the feeling of love and the choice of love, and she had concluded that what she was doing, the choosing, the staying, the building, was the real thing, and that the lack of aliveness she sometimes felt was simply evidence of her own growth. She did not consider that aliveness and presence are not the same country. She did not consider that you can choose someone every day and still be somewhere they cannot reach. Marcus, for his part, had not left. He was still the man who came home every night. Still, the man who took out the trash without being asked and remembered her parents' anniversary and read his Bible on Sunday mornings at the kitchen table in the particular unhurried way that meant he was actually reading it and not performing devotion. He still reached for her hand in church. He still made coffee for 2 every morning, even on the mornings she was running late and didn't drink it. But something had changed in him over the past 18 months, and it had changed the way the tide changes, gradually, then suddenly, then simply as the new state of the water. He had stopped telling her things. Not the practical things. He still told her about the schedule, the bills, the car maintenance, the logistics of a shared life, but the interior things, the student in his third period who reminded him of himself at 17, the book he had finished that cracked something open in him, the conversation he had with God at 5 a.m. that he could not fully articulate, but that had left him changed in some way he was still measuring. These things, the things that were most alive in him, he had stopped bringing to her. Not because she had ever told him to stop. Because he had brought them many times, and she had been somewhere else when he did. Not cruel, not dismissive, just elsewhere, half attending, the way you half attend to something when your mind is on the next thing, on the email you need to send, on the problem you are still running in the background of your consciousness. She never said, "I'm not interested." She said, "and that's good, babe," and continued what she was doing, and he had learned, over 18 months of MMMS, that the things most alive in him were not safe to bring into this room. So he stopped bringing them. And the room got quieter. And she did not notice the room getting quieter because she was somewhere else. Jordan Webb was not a woman who did nothing. This is important. This is the part that made the self-deception so total and so genuinely difficult to excavate. She was doing everything. She worked as a program director at a nonprofit focused on literacy in underserved communities, work that mattered, that she believed in, that required her full and genuine investment. She served on 2 committees at their church. She maintained their home with the care of someone who understood that environment was not superficial. She cooked real meals. She kept track of the doctor's appointments and the oil changes and the extended family obligations. She called her mother-in-law on her birthday, had learned all her recipes, made Marcus's childhood favorites from scratch on his bad days. She was, by every external measure, a good wife. She knew this. She had organized her life around being this, and the organization had been so successful that she had no remaining bandwidth for the thing that was not on any list, the quality of her actual presence, the degree to which she was, in the room she physically occupied, actually in it. She had maximized every metric except the one that cannot be measured. Her best friend, Diane, saw it before she did. Diane Williams had known Jordan since college, the kind of friendship that survives distance and divergence and the years when both people are too busy to call. She was a direct woman, the kind who said the important things sideways. The way you say something when you love someone and are not sure they are ready to hear it straight on. They were at brunch on a Sunday in March when Diane said it. "How's Marcus?" "He's good," Jordan said. "Tired. End of the semester always gets like this." Diane stirred her drink. "When did you last ask him how he was? Like actually ask?" Jordan looked up. "I just said he's." "You just told me what season it is," Diane said. "I asked when you last asked him." Jordan set her fork down. "I ask him things all the time, Diane." "I know you do." Diane was not accusatory. She was careful, the way you are careful when you are holding something fragile. "I'm not saying you don't talk to him. I'm saying, when did you last sit with him, just sit, not managing anything, not running anything, just be with him. Jordan opened her mouth. She closed it. She could not find a specific recent memory. She said, "We're together every evening." Diane looked at her for a moment, then she looked at her drink. "Okay," she said, and did not say anything else. Jordan drove home from brunch, with both hands on the wheel and a low-grade irritation she would spend the next 3 days misidentifying as tiredness. The scripture arrived that same evening. She was not looking for it. She was doing her Sunday reading, a practice she maintained faithfully, 30 minutes every Sunday evening with her Bible and a cup of tea, and she was in Proverbs, which she had read many times, and she was moving through it with the comfortable familiarity of a person visiting a neighborhood she knows well. She was in chapter 31, The Capable Wife. She had always loved this passage, had returned to it many times, had used it as a kind of internal benchmark, a checklist of the woman she was working to become. She read through it. She arrived at verse 11, "The heart of her husband trusts in her." She stopped, not because the words were unfamiliar, because she read them and felt, for the first time, something beneath them that she had not felt before, a question embedded in the statement, a question that arrived not from the page, but from somewhere below the page, from the place where the Spirit speaks when it has been waiting for the right moment. Does he? She sat with the verse for a long time. She thought, of course he trusts me. I have never given him a reason not to. She thought, I have been faithful, I have been consistent, I have been here. She did not think, trust is not only the absence of betrayal, trust is the presence of something, the belief that you will be received, the confidence that what is most alive in you is safe in the hands of the person who holds you. She did not think this, because thinking it would have required her to ask whether Marcus still believed he was safe to be received by her, and she was not ready to ask that yet. She closed her Bible. She made a note in her journal, Proverbs 31:11, revisit. She did not revisit it that week. God noted this. The first time Jordan noticed something was wrong, really noticed, in the body rather than the mind, was on a Tuesday evening in April. They were in the kitchen after dinner. She was at the sink. He was at the table with a book. This was normal. This was the rhythm of their evenings, the comfortable parallel occupation of shared space that she had long ago concluded was healthy, was evidence of a couple secure enough not to need to perform togetherness. He said, "I've been thinking about leaving teaching." She was rinsing a pan. The water was running. She said, "Okay." She turned off the water. She dried her hands. She turned around. He was looking at the book, not reading it, looking at the page, his thumb at the corner, not turning it. She said, "What made you think of that?" "I've been thinking about it for a while," he said. "Like, what would you do instead?" "I don't know yet. That's part of what I'm sitting with." She leaned against the counter. She looked at him. He was still looking at the book, not reading it. She said, "I think you should be careful about making a big decision when you're tired. End of the semester, always." "I'm not tired," he said. His voice was level, not sharp, not cold, just precise, the voice of someone correcting a factual error. She looked at him. He finally turned the page. She said, "Okay, well, I mean, we'd need to talk about the finances if you were seriously considering it. The mortgage." "I know about the mortgage," he said. Another page turn. She stood at the counter for a moment longer. She felt something in the room, a pressure, a quality of silence that she could not name. She said, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said. She went back to the dishes. She did not know that she had just done, in miniature, the thing she had been doing for 18 months. She had taken the most alive thing he brought into the room, his uncertainty, his searching, the question he was sitting with about the shape of his own life, and she had immediately redirected it toward logistics and caution and the sensible management of risk. She had not sat with him in it for even 60 seconds. She had not asked what the thinking felt like. She had not leaned forward. She had offered, instead, a practical concern and a small dismissal wearing the costume of care. He had felt this. He had not said so. He turned another page. The thing about Marcus's pain was that it had no drama. It did not arrive in a fight, not in a speech, not in any of the forms that would have made it legible to her as pain. It arrived in the incremental, wordless specificity of a man adjusting his behavior to the available space. He stopped telling her about the student in third period. He stopped sharing the 5 a.m. thoughts. He started taking longer drives home from work, not because he was avoiding her, but because the car was the only place where he did not have to manage the gap between who he was and who she was currently able to receive. He drove with the radio off. He prayed in the car, which he had never done before. His prayer life had always been private and morning-based, but now it spilled into the car because the car was where he could be fully present with God in a way he could not currently be fully present with his wife. He ate lunch alone at his desk and did not tell her. He began to write in a journal, small, black, kept in his work bag, and she never knew it existed. He still came home every night. He still made coffee for two. He still reached for her hand in church. But something was happening behind his eyes that she was not reading, and he had stopped expecting her to read it, and the stopping of the expectation had its own specific gravity, its own slow cost, the way a room loses heat not all at once, but degree by degree, until one morning you wake up, and it is cold, and you cannot remember when it changed. His name was Derek. He was not a temptation in the traditional sense. He was a colleague, a program officer at a foundation that funded Jordan's organization, professional, married, entirely appropriate in every formal sense. He was also the kind of man who listened with his whole body, who turned to face you when you spoke, who asked the second question and the third, who made you feel, and this is the precise and dangerous thing, like what you were saying mattered more than whatever was next on his list. Jordan began to notice this in March, in a quarterly meeting, when she was presenting her program's outcomes, and Derek asked a follow-up question that demonstrated he had read not only her report, but the supplementary literature she had referenced. She stopped mid-sentence. She looked at him. He was looking back with the full, uncomplicated attention of someone who was genuinely interested. She finished her presentation. She thought about his question on the drive home. She told herself this was professional appreciation. She was not wrong. It was professional appreciation. It was also the first time in several months that she had felt the specific experience of being fully attended to, and the feeling had a physical quality, a warmth, a kind of aliveness that she had not recognized as missing until it arrived. She did not tell Marcus about Derek. Not because she was hiding him, because there was nothing to hide. Because she was a woman of integrity who had done nothing wrong and was not going to do anything wrong, and the idea of mentioning a colleague who had asked good questions would have seemed, to her, unnecessary and slightly paranoid. She also thought about his question 3 more times that week. She also found herself, on the morning of their next meeting, choosing her clothes with a slightly different quality of attention than usual. She also found herself, mid-meeting, deploying the specific version of her humor she reserved for people she wanted to impress, the dry, quick, self-aware version. Not the easier version she used with people she was comfortable with. She did not examine any of this. She was a woman of integrity. She was not doing anything wrong. The not wrongness was doing structural work she had